October 17, 1931. Federal Courthouse, Chicago, 2:47 p.m. The courtroom is packed. Reporters, photographers, federal agents, curious citizens who lined up at dawn for a chance to witness history. The air is thick with anticipation, with the smell of wood polish and nervous sweat. Every eye is fixed on the front of the room, where 12 ordinary citizens sit in the jury box, holding the fate of America's most notorious gangster in their hands. Al Capone sits at the defense table, custom-tailored suit, silk tie, diamond ring catching the afternoon light. His face is expressionless, that famous scar on his left cheek a white line against his olive skin. For 3 weeks he sat in this chair watching prosecutor George Johnson parade witness after witness to the stand. Accountants, bookkeepers, store owners, building a case, piece by piece, that Capone earned vast sums of money and paid not a single dollar in taxes. The jury foreman stands. He's holding a piece of paper. The verdict. The courtroom falls into absolute silence. You could hear a heartbeat. You could hear someone's breath catch in their throat. Judge James Wilkerson leans forward. "Mr. Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." This is the moment when the most powerful criminal in American history learns whether he's beaten the government one more time or whether his empire, built on blood and bribery and billions in illegal alcohol, is finally over. The foreman begins to read, and Al Capone, the man who built Chicago into his personal kingdom, who murdered rivals without blinking, who corrupted judges and bought politicians like other men bought newspapers, does something no one expects. He doesn't look up. This is that story, not the trial itself, not the years of investigation, but this single frozen moment when everything changed, and what that moment revealed about the man who thought he was untouchable.
To understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to understand what the trial had been for Al Capone. It wasn't justice, it was theater, and Capone was performing. From the moment he walked into that courthouse on October 6, 1931, Capone had played the role of the confident defendant. He smiled at reporters. He joked with his lawyers. He wore a different expensive suit every day, each one a silent message. "I'm not worried. I'm still in control. This is beneath me." During jury selection, Capone had been almost jovial. He studied potential jurors like a talent scout, nodding approval at some, shaking his head slightly at others. His lead attorney, the legendary Albert Fink, worked the courtroom like a maestro, challenging jurors for the slightest hint of bias. Capone had brought in the best legal team money could buy, literally. Rumors swirled that he was paying his lawyers $1,000 a day. In 1931, that's like paying $15,000 a day in today's money. But there was a problem Capone didn't fully grasp until it was too late. Judge James Wilkerson was not for sale. On the first day of trial, Capone's team had walked into court confident they had the jury fixed. 10 of the 12 jurors, they believed, were either bribed or intimidated. The trial would be a formality. Capone would walk, just like he'd walked away from every other charge the government had tried to make stick. But Wilkerson had heard the rumors, and in a move that shocked everyone, he switched the entire jury pool with one from another trial at the last minute, just swapped them. Capone's bought jury never even made it into the jury box. For the first time in his criminal career, Capone was facing something he couldn't fix. But he kept performing, even as the prosecution built their case, witness by witness, receipt by receipt. Capone maintained the facade. He whispered to his lawyers. He took notes. He looked bored during testimony, as if the whole proceeding was just a minor inconvenience. The prosecution's case was elegant in its simplicity. They couldn't prove Capone ran a bootlegging empire. Witnesses wouldn't testify, evidence disappeared. But they could prove something else. Capone spent money, lots of money. Custom suits at hundreds of dollars each, furniture worth thousands, hotel suites, cars, jewelry, a mansion in Florida, and he'd never filed a tax return, not once. The lead prosecutor, George Johnson, a square-jawed federal attorney with a reputation for incorruptibility, laid it out for the jury in language anyone could understand. The defendant lived like a king. He spent like a millionaire, but he claims he earned nothing. Are we to believe that Al Capone, a man who lives in luxury, who wears diamonds and drives Cadillacs, has no income? The evidence speaks for itself. Capone's defense was equally simple. He was just a gambler. Sometimes he won, sometimes he lost. The money he spent came from winnings, not income, and gambling winnings, under the law at the time, weren't always taxable. It was flimsy, but it was the best they had. For 3 weeks the trial proceeded. Capone showed up every day, impeccably dressed, playing the role of the wrongly accused businessman. His mother attended, sitting in the gallery, a small woman in a dark dress, rosary beads in her hands. The message was clear. Look at this devoted son. How could he be the monster the government claims? But beneath the performance, something was changing. The reporters noticed it first. Capone's confident demeanor was cracking. His smile became forced. He stopped joking with his lawyers. During breaks, he chain-smoked in the hallway, his hands shaking slightly as he lit one cigarette after another. By the final week of testimony, the reality was setting in. This wasn't like the murder trials he'd beaten. There was no main witness to intimidate. There was no smoking gun to make disappear. The evidence was paper, numbers, receipts, bank records. You can't threaten a receipt. You can't bribe a ledger. The prosecution rested. The defense rested. Both sides gave closing arguments, and then the jury retired to deliberate.
9 hours. That's how long the jury deliberated. 9 hours that must have felt like 9 years to Al Capone. He waited in a room adjacent to the courtroom, surrounded by his lawyers and his bodyguards. They played cards to pass the time. They smoked. They didn't talk much about what was happening. What was there to say? But here's what was going through Capone's mind, according to those who were there. Disbelief. Even then, even with the evidence piled against him, even with a jury he couldn't control, Capone couldn't fully accept that he might actually lose. You have to understand the psychology of who Capone was by this point. For over a decade, he had been invincible, untouchable. He'd survived assassination attempts. He'd beaten murder charges. He'd corrupted an entire city's political and legal system. In his world, Al Capone didn't lose. Al Capone made other people lose. The tax evasion charges had seemed like a joke to him at first, an annoyance, something his lawyers would handle. How do you go to prison for not filing paperwork? How does Al Capone, who'd ordered the deaths of dozens of men, who'd controlled Chicago like a personal fiefdom, get taken down by accountants? But as the trial progressed, as the evidence mounted, as the jury listened attentively instead of looking away like bought jurors should, the impossible became possible, and then probable, and then, as those 9 hours ticked by, inevitable. His lawyers tried to prepare him. Albert Fink, normally confident and bombastic, was subdued. "Al," he said quietly, "we need to discuss the possibility." "Don't," Capone cut him off. "Don't say it." But they both knew. The jury had been out too long. If they were going to acquit, it would have been quick. 9 hours meant they were arguing, debating, going through the evidence, and the more they looked at the evidence, the worse it was for Capone. At one point, Capone stood and walked to the window. The courthouse overlooked downtown Chicago, his city, the city he'd controlled for a decade. From this height, he could see the neighborhoods where his speakeasies operated, the streets where his trucks delivered illegal beer, the hotels where his gambling operations ran 24 hours a day. He'd built an empire, and it was about to end over tax returns. "It's not fair," he said to no one in particular. "I gave people what they wanted. The government made alcohol illegal, and I gave people a way to get it. I employed thousands. I fed the hungry. What the hell did the government ever do for Chicago that I didn't do better?" No one answered, because the truth was, fair didn't matter. Legal mattered, and Al Capone, for all his power, had broken the law in a way that was impossible to deny. There's a detail here that most people don't know. During those 9 hours, Capone received a visit from his younger brother, Ralph. Ralph was emotional, near tears. "We're going to beat this, Al," he said. "We always do." Capone looked at his brother, and for just a moment, the mask dropped. "No," he said quietly, "not this time." Then the mask went back up. The performance resumed. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, Capone straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and walked back into the courtroom with his head high and that familiar confidence plastered across his face. But inside, Al Capone knew. He knew before the verdict was read. He knew before the jury foreman stood up. He knew the moment they deliberated past the first hour. He was finished. The courtroom reassembles. Capone takes his seat at the defense table. His lawyers sit on either side of him. Behind him, his brother Ralph, his cousin Charlie, a few loyal associates, the men who'd helped him build his empire and who would now watch it fall. The jury files in. Capone doesn't look at them. It's a tell. An experienced defense attorney can often predict a verdict by watching jurors' faces when they return. If they look at the defendant, it's usually good news. If they avoid eye contact, it's bad. Capone's lawyers know this. Capone knows this, and the jury isn't looking at him. Judge Wilkerson calls the court to order. The formalities are observed, and then the question, "Mr. Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." This is when it happens, the moment that will be reported in newspapers across the country the next day, the moment that will become part of Capone's legend. The foreman begins to read. There are multiple counts. The jury has to announce their verdict on each one. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, not guilty. Count 4, guilty. On and on through all 23 counts. And through it all, Al Capone doesn't look up. He sits perfectly still, staring down at his hands folded on the table in front of him. His face is expressionless. His body doesn't move. He could be a statue. The only sign of life is a slight tightening of his jaw, a muscle twitching in his cheek just below that famous scar. Why? Why this reaction from a man famous for his bravado, his confidence, his in-your-face defiance of authority? One reporter, sitting close enough to see, would later write, "It was as if Capone had left his body, as if the man sitting there was just an empty shell, and the real Al Capone had already fled to some place where guilty verdicts couldn't reach him." But I think it was something else. I think in that moment, Al Capone was doing the only thing he had left, refusing to give them the satisfaction. The government wanted him broken. They wanted to see fear in his eyes. They wanted the great Al Capone, the man who'd terrorized Chicago, to crack in front of a room full of witnesses and reporters. They wanted a photograph of his face when he heard guilty. They wanted him to look shocked or scared or devastated. So he gave them nothing. No reaction, no emotion, no photograph worth printing. It was the last bit of control he had, and he exercised it with the same ruthless efficiency he'd used to build his empire. But the people who were there, who saw it up close, they knew the truth. This wasn't strength. This was defeat so complete that there was no point in even acknowledging it. 5 counts guilty, 5 counts of failing to file tax returns, enough to send him to prison for years. Judge Wilkerson asks if Capone has anything to say before sentencing. This is the moment for a defendant to show remorse, to beg for mercy, to try one last time to sway the judge. Capone's lawyer starts to stand, but Capone puts a hand on his arm, stops him. Then, finally, Capone looks up, not at the jury, not at the judge, but at the back of the courtroom where his mother is sitting, clutching her rosary, tears streaming down her face. Their eyes meet for just a moment, and then Capone looks back down. "No, Your Honor," his lawyer says. "The defendant has nothing to say." Judge Wilkerson sentences Capone immediately. 11 years in federal prison, $50,000 fine, 7 years probation after release.
the longest sentence for tax evasion ever handed down at that time. Capone is taken into custody. No more fancy suits and custom Cadillacs, no more nights at the opera or front row seats at boxing matches. He's processed, fingerprinted, photographed, inmate number 40886. He appeals, of course, spends 10 months fighting the conviction, but the appeals fail. The evidence is too solid, the verdict too sound. In May 1932, Al Capone begins serving his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Later, he'll be transferred to Alcatraz, the new federal super prison built specifically to hold criminals like him in a place where corruption and escape are impossible. He'll spend years there, his health deteriorating from untreated syphilis, his mind slowly unraveling. By the time he's released in 1939, he's a shell of the man who once controlled Chicago. But that moment in the courtroom, that moment when he didn't look up, that's what people remember. The newspapers the next day have headlines screaming about the verdict, photos of the courtroom, interviews with jurors. But the detail they all focus on is that moment. Capone unmoved as verdict read. Scareface shows no emotion. The man who controlled Chicago stares at his hands as empire falls. Because it was so perfectly symbolic. The man who demanded the world look at him, fear him, respect him, finally had nothing to say, nothing to show, nothing left but silence and a bowed head. And maybe that's the real lesson of Al Capone's trial. Power, even absolute power, is temporary. Empires, even criminal empires that seem invincible, can fall. And when they do, when there's nothing left to say and nowhere left to run, sometimes the only thing left is to not look up, to not acknowledge the verdict being read, to not give them the satisfaction of seeing you broken. But here's the darkest irony. By not looking up, by showing no emotion, Capone created the most memorable moment of his trial. The image of him sitting there, silent and still, became more powerful than any dramatic reaction could have been. Even in defeat, even in that courtroom when everything was lost, Al Capone was still performing, still controlling the narrative, still making sure that the story they'd tell about him would be the one he wanted told. The verdict was read, and Al Capone didn't look up. Because even at the end, even when there was nothing left to control, he refused to let them see him fall.